Live from SABC headquarters in Auckland Park, Johannesburg. Welcome to this Tuesday edition of the Watchdog. My name is Vuyo Mvogo, and on the show this evening, the silent crisis, a damning report on the state of basic education in the country. We speak to the originators of the report before our panel consisting of academics and the National Education Department weighs in. The Watchdog starts now. South Africa has one of the worst performing education systems in the world. Well, that's according to a series of reports released today by a leading development think tank, the Center for Development Enterprise, CDE. Speaking at a function where the reports were released to the public, CDE Executive Director Anne Bernstein said the time has come for society, business, all political parties, parents and the public to up the pressure on government and push for system-wide reforms that significantly improve the quality of teaching in the classroom. Anne Bernstein joins us on the line to take us through these reports. Good evening, Anne. Thanks very much for your time.
Well, thank you for having me, Vuyo. Great to be here.
Perhaps before we can get to aspects of the reports themselves, the reason why you felt this was an important issue to highlight and do that in the manner that you did, because we have an unemployment crisis, we have an electricity crisis, we have all manner of crises, and we're not doing much, if anything, to actually resolve them. And by and large, the experience has been that we don't even diagnose the problems correctly, and that perhaps explains why we are failing or finding it difficult to resolve these crises.
That's a good question, Vuyo, and let me start with, there are many people who might say, why is CDE adding yet another priority to a growing list of national priorities? And clearly there are other issues: power, generation, crime, jobs and growth, as you pointed out, not to mention our ports and rail. We're very well aware of that, and we have also called for prioritization by the country and the president for action. But you have to ask yourself this question: are you prepared to condemn millions of South African learners to yet another round of terrible education? So that's the question that motivated us. We've done a lot of work on various other issues, and we're not naive in thinking that this government is going to act. I believed the president when in 2017 he launched his campaign to be the ANC president, when he said he wanted to reform education, he wanted to improve our schooling system. And so we started thinking about that project as long ago as that. It was delayed during COVID, but we now think it's really important that in the lead up to the general election next year, and then hopefully a new government, that we make this one of the top priorities for the country. There is no focus on the importance of basic schooling and making this far, far better than it is today. And so we're trying to mobilize everybody to shout out about the changes that have to be made to improve South Africa's basic schooling.
Is it for lack of trying on the part of those in charge, or those who are tasked with dealing with these issues?
Look, we've had a minister since 2009, and in the very low bar of our cabinets, she has been one of the better performers. And it's very unusual for CDE to call for a new minister, which is what we're doing. A new minister, a new DG, a top team in both the national department and in many of the provinces. But we're doing this for the following reasons. The minister has tried to introduce important reforms. She introduced a unit in her department to investigate what was going on in basic schooling around the country, NEDU, but then that was reduced to almost a meaningless unit because of the pressures against the findings that it had in its first major report and its independence. She tried to introduce performance management into this vast system, but after years of negotiation, she retreated because of pressures from the unions, particularly SATU. And the same with the national assessments. She tried to introduce this, they did do it, and then it was withdrawn because of opposition from SATU. But the most important reason we are calling for this is because the minister has failed to deal with cadre deployment and corruption throughout the education bureaucracy. She had the courage to appoint an impressive task team in 2014 to deal with allegations in the newspapers about the selling of principal positions in Natal and elsewhere. She did set up this committee, the task team. They reported in 2016, and their report was damning. But she has not implemented any one of the corruption-related recommendations from that task team to this day. So those are some of the reasons why we're saying we need a very different, energetic new team at the top of basic education. They need to be committed to reform. They need to be ready to deal with the tough issues, and they need some public targets that they set themselves. We have to move off the bottom of almost every single international test that our learners do. We have to move up, and we have to make sure that nearly 80% of our kids in grade 4 who cannot read for meaning, that this terrible situation starts to change as quickly as possible.
Now let's get into which you just started doing. Let's get into some aspects of these reports, starting with which is an issue that Report 1 speaks to in part, and that is the fact that we are, as a country and as a percentage of the GDP, spending on education. The education allocation is the biggest item. But of course, over the years, people have been saying that we're not getting bang for our buck. For the 2023-2024 year, we're talking about 309 billion rands that we spend on education.
It's about 13% of the national budget. I'm not sure it's the largest item, but it's very large indeed. And we don't think the amount of money that we spend is the issue. The question is, what are we getting for it? And I think there are three reasons why we're struggling to perform as a system. The one is our teachers are struggling. Professor Nick Spall has said that 4 out of 5 South African teachers are not equipped, both in terms of subject content and teaching skills, pedagogical skills, to teach effectively, whether it's in maths or in reading. That's a very damning conclusion about the state of our teachers. We don't train them well at our universities. We don't select them well. And although it's started to improve with some new teachers coming through that are better, we're arguing that the teachers are struggling. And the minister herself has said a few years ago that we have the highest absentee rate of all the SADC countries. So that's pretty damning. That's the first issue on how we're spending our money. The second is, as I've said, we have the leading trade union, the dominant trade union, has a policy of cadre deployment into the schooling system. That is coupled with enormous corruption in the schooling system. I'll just give you one story. I happened to see a newspaper article about a Soweto school, and the treasurer of the school governing body said something like the following. He said, "The education department are gangsters, and they are looting everything to do with our school and the budget we should be getting. We're appealing for help from law enforcement and from the SIU." This is not just one isolated example. Corruption Watch found a lot of reports of corruption in education last year. And as I've said, the 2016 report was damning in its findings on corruption, none of which were followed through, no criminal prosecutions on the 38 cases that they highlighted. And they said at the time that SATU is in charge of the management, administration, and priorities of at least 6, probably more, provincial education departments. This affects the quality of the bureaucracy. It affects the quality of our principals and teachers. So if you're a good teacher, you can imagine what it feels like to know somebody bought their position and they're not really up to the job. You can imagine what it feels like if you're a good teacher who comes every day and works hard, and the person getting the same salary as you doesn't pitch up on Mondays or Fridays and really doesn't work hard at all. So all of this seeps through to a system that is not performing.
Now, you highlight, or the report highlights, countries like Morocco, Egypt, and Albania, who are developing countries, but when you compared South Africa against, these countries, you found that, they spend far less per capita on education than we do. What are the things that these countries are doing, whether it's about how they train their teachers or how the system is managed, and how stakeholder management? And I'm raising this on the back of what you've just said about SATU.
Well, Vuyo, that finding comes not from work we did, but from an Oxford and Harvard professor, Lant Pritchard, probably the leading scholar analyzing education systems and reform across the world. And he looked at World Bank data, and that was his conclusion, that South Africa was the biggest underperformer compared to all those other countries, many of which are poorer than us, for per capita income. So that was his conclusion and his work across very many countries. We didn't have the resources to look at all those different countries. We did look at one country and the research on Peru, which is one of Latin America's star performers. And we looked at Latin America because we were looking for countries with high inequality and with strong trade unions, and not ideal histories like South Africa's, a lot of poverty and problems in the communities where schools are located. And Peru is interesting because they came last in one of the major international tests in 2012. And the new Minister of Education immediately owned the problem. He said, we're in deep trouble and we're going to do something about this. And they did start testing teachers and a number of other sort of activities that we are advocating, and those delivered results. By 2018, they had jumped over 12 other countries to move off the bottom of that international table to deliver. So testing teachers and principals was very important, and monitoring developments very closely to see how your reforms were working and what you could be adjusting as you went along, and not just waiting until the matric exam.
Now, among the other issues, of course, the report's raising is poor accountability, which you've been speaking to, but also a corruption, which is we have spoken to, but also the issue of cadre deployment and too many incompetent staff members is how the report puts it. Is it a lack of will? Is there a lack of will to tackle this issue? And I've seen how the debate has kind of started changing. People from the governing party saying, "Well, this is only raised with regard to, national government and provinces run by the ANC. No one says anything about the Western Cape and how rife cadre deployment is there," which to me is really, playing around with, we shouldn't even be talking about that. We should be talking about how to tackle the problem that the president has actually, spoke about at length at the state capture inquiry, because he presided over that deployment, structure of the governing party. So we should focus on what matters, which is what to do with the issue of cadre deployment, which has proven to be a big problem.
Well, I couldn't agree more with that. Look, the Chief Justice of the country in the Zondo report last year said that cadre deployment was effectively unlawful and unconstitutional. Now, this is a formal policy of SATU, and at the time of the Ministerial Task Team in 2016, they discovered that all the Deputy Directors General in Education were active members of SATU attending union meetings. Now you have to ask yourself, can a union run the country's education department? And our answer is no. We are certainly in favor of unions, and teachers have every right to form their own unions, and there are a number of them. Managers in our bureaucracy have a right to form their own union if they want to, but they can't be in the same union. You can't be a manager and a member of SATU. This is just not good practice. And so we're saying what you have to do now, we're saying there are 5 things that the country should focus on very briefly. Firstly, we have to recognize and then tackle cadre deployment and corruption in the education bureaucracy. What government must do is take a strong stand against this in education, and they have to work with SATU to say cadre deployment into the education bureaucracy is not on. We need to protect whistleblowers. All the things we're saying nationally, Vuyo, we need to say about education. And the department needs to lead on this. We need to protect whistleblowers. We need criminal prosecutions. We need to root out corruption. And we need to stop cadre deployment. We need a system that is built on merit. And people need to apply for positions and know that they will get a fair interview, that bribery is not involved, and the best candidate will be appointed. So that's absolutely vital, that we move the system as fast as possible away from the terrible things that are being reported to be happening and that the Ministerial Task Team discovered. So, for example, one of the recommendations from the task team in 2016 was to renegotiate SATU's special right to sit in on recruitment negotiations and hearings. So there's a lot to be done, and the task team spelt it all out for the department. That's one critical thing we've got to do to move away from what is a really extremely worrying situation that affects the competence of the bureaucracy and teachers and principals and our ability to deliver the quality learning in our classrooms that we desperately need.
Is there anything that you found, was there anything that you found to be working, or at least something to build upon?
Look, there's certainly innovations in the last 12, 14 years that have been positive. If you remember, quite a long time ago, there was a lot of talk about introducing workbooks. This has been done to schools throughout the country, and it is certainly helping some teachers to know what they should be teaching week by week. That's a good thing. And there are definitely schools. We're not saying that all South African schools are terrible. There are schools, there are special principals and wonderful teachers working in very difficult circumstances around the country. But overall, we are not delivering, and that's why we're at the bottom of international tables. We did get some changes happening from about 2005 to 2015, and credit must be given for that. Partly people are saying because of the introduction of the ANAs, the annual assessments, and of NEDU's role, but then those were withdrawn. And since about 2015, 2016, the positive developments we were starting to see from a very low base have stopped. And then COVID hit us, which was devastating to South Africa and many other countries' education systems. And it's estimated that a 10-year-old child today, or learner today, is about a year behind where they should be. Now, the question I would ask is, what is the plan to deal with this? We're not seeing that. So it's not everything's terrible, but we need to be honest with ourselves that this is not a well-functioning system, and we have to introduce system-wide reforms in order to get the basics working properly so that we can move forward. We also need some public targets. So, for example, in 2019, the president said in a speech that we should teach all our learners should be able to read for meaning by 2030. But these were just words in a speech. As the recent reading panel report told us, there's no national reading plan, there's no budget, there's no indication of what progress is being made or how they're attempting to do this. In fact, they would argue that we've probably gone back a bit since 2019. So we're in favor of clear targets. We're suggesting other targets. For example, let's be like Peru. Vuyo, you will like this. They had a wonderful statement. The minister said, well, we can't beat Brazil at soccer, but we're going to beat them at maths. And so maybe South Africa should say, we are going to aim every 5 years to move up 12 places in the international tables. That's the target. Judge us on that target, and we're going to do everything we can to do that. And so otherwise, how do you move up? How do we assess the system, and how do we assess that we're getting value for money?
And Bernstein, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity.
The CDE releasing that report, those reports today to the public, which really paints an unflattering picture of our basic education system. Time to take a quick ad break before our panel of experts, including a leading official of the Department of Education, weighs in. If you've just tuned in, our focus this evening is on the state of South Africa's education system, following reports released earlier today by a leading development think tank, the Centre for Development Enterprise. The CDE reports conclude that South Africa has one of the worst performing education systems in the world. CDE Executive Director Anne Bernstein has just taken us through the reports. Let's now welcome our panel for this evening. In studio, I'm joined by Dr. Stephen Taylor from the National Department of Basic Education, where he is the Director for Research Monitoring. On the line, we have Professor Tobe Ganganyo from the Walter Sisulu University's Education Department, and we also have education activist Hendrik Maganeta. Good evening to all of you, and thank you so much for your time.
Good evening. Thank you for having us.
Let me start with you, Dr. Taylor, if I may. Going through that report, these reports of the Centre for Development Enterprises, what stood out for you?
Well, one thing which I think we would all welcome is the idea that despite the many priorities that South Africa has, that education should absolutely be one of the very top priorities. I think we would agree with that. It's in the long-term interest of the development of our country that we keep improving the education system that we have. Another thing that stands out for me is that the report draws attention to a lot of important challenges that we do have, and which the department would certainly acknowledge and be the first to provide information on. The report also acknowledges that there has been improvement in the sector, but perhaps the attention it gives is not as much as the attention and emphasis and tone devoted to the problems that we face.
Mm-hmm. But I mean, it does, you're correct, highlight improvements or some gains that have been made over the years, but then it also says that there's been a decline. In other words, those victories or positives have been undone, basically.
What's interesting to me, I don't think the report actually says there's been a decline, and in a way they can't, because the facts don't justify a decline. There's been consistent improvements over the years on pretty much every indicator of education system performance, from participation rates in schooling to the quality of learning outcomes, to the completion rates, the percentages that complete matric, that enter university. All of those indicators have been improving, and in a more equitable way, with the possible exception of the impact of the pandemic in the last 3 years. There, I think the department would acknowledge that it has done damage to the system. With that exception, I think and I don't read the report as saying there's been a decline, aside from perhaps the impact of the pandemic.
Prof, your thoughts upon reading these CDE reports?
Good evening to the listeners and everybody. My thoughts also are that the report is talking about the dysfunctionality of the Department of Basic Education. However, there are some issues with the education system. For instance, we can talk about a curriculum that is fit one, fit all, of which it does not address the issues of learner abilities, and we can see that there is no investment in issues of early childhood, and we can also see that there is a lack of a shortage of provision of scarce skills like mathematics, accounting, sciences, and entrepreneurship. So the report is not that much on those issues, but however, it is showing issues of GDP per capita, which shows that there is a low economic development, and of which now and is comparing that with other countries. I wouldn't take that much on the issue of COVID, because it's a global issue. It affected everything, so we could not attest to that much. Thank you.
Mr. Maganeta, just your thoughts overall, yeah?
Thank you very much indeed, Vuyo. I think that the Centre for Development Enterprise should be applauded for coming up with this report. And I think such reports actually prepare us as the nation to do better in areas where we are failing. This report, along with the previous other similar reports, such as the trends in international mathematics and science studies, have also shown that South Africa is not doing well when it comes to the performance of mathematics and science. And the reports of the Center for Development Enterprise also highlights the issue of unions. In this case, I heard them citing the biggest union, which sometimes makes it difficult for proper teaching and learning to take place. But I think that, in my view, Vuyo, I cannot necessarily blame SATU, for instance, in this case, as the biggest union. I think that there are several factors that impact our education negatively, and factors such as indiscipline amongst our learners, particularly in public schools, where you find that learners are not always motivated, along with their teachers. The issue of poor infrastructure, which affects teaching and learning, particularly in township, as well as rural schools. And I think that we must, at this point, applaud government for taking the time and the trouble to put in place good policies, which, for example, now with this, the basic education bill, the amendment bill, it seeks to address issues of compulsory attendance of learners starting from grade R. So it will become an offense if parents decide to keep their learners at home, especially those who are supposed to be in grade R. And at that point, we must applaud them. But I think that there are still many issues that need to be addressed in the system with a view to ensure that our learners can be able to improve in their performance.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Taylor, let's start with the issue of money, which the report raises, was like report one right at the beginning raises, which is that, for the 2023-2024 fiscal year, we're talking about 309 billion rands that goes to education in this country. But as everyone has been saying, we're not getting bang for the buck. And the report says that it is not about money. Then they go on to quote countries like Morocco and so on, which spend far less in education, but the suggestion there is that but they have better results than some of us, because they're not at the bottom of the rung. Just from conversations and what was happening within the department, does this issue get the kind of focus that experts say it deserves?
It does get focus, and right now the sector is under financial pressures, and it's coming from two angles. On the one hand, government in general is under financial pressure, so the amount of money being dedicated to basic education is not fast increasing, especially when you take account of teacher salaries. But also, what's maybe less well known is that there've been quite significant growth in enrollments in the sector. So things like learner-educator ratios are under some pressure due to financial pressures. So finance does matter, but it's also not quite as simple as some of these cross-country comparisons might make it out to be. The reality is that in all countries, the majority of education spending does go towards teacher salaries. So to a large extent, that is dependent on the nature of the labor markets in those countries, which is not just the education sector. So in South Africa, for instance, our teachers are within a broader public sector and overall labor market. So some of those comparisons are a little bit misleading. And the other thing to note is that a couple of times you've mentioned that South Africa is at the very bottom, and that's not entirely true. We are near the bottom of some of the international assessments in which mostly European, North American, and East Asian countries take part, but very few other developing countries or African countries. But when you look at, say, the SACMEC assessment, which includes 15 Southern and East African countries, there we're slightly above average. So we participate in assessments that many countries which potentially would perform worse than us don't participate. So I think that's maybe worth mentioning as well.
But be that as it may, perhaps, Dr. Taylor, but does it not worry? Is it not an issue for you that whatever comparisons we make, one, we are not getting value, and all these other problems that these reports raise are also true. In other words, as you said earlier, these were things that are acknowledged by the department itself. So it shouldn't really matter whether, perhaps we are comparing or we're not comparing apples with apples. What should matter is the fact that we're not doing well, and everyone agrees.
Yes. No, sure, and I do agree. We do need better return on our investment, to put it in those terms. I do agree. But as I said, we are improving. So the return on investment is potentially improving over time. But I still agree with the challenges, even that the report outlines as to some of the reasons for the lack of return of investment. And if we think about how we're going to get better return on investment, it is better support to teachers. It is more accountability in the system, as the report calls for, in particular accountability for learning and making learning the central goal of the education system that everyone understands, and that does hold us as government accountable to. So I would agree that there are ways to improve the return on our investment. Absolutely.
Well, Prof, one of the things to emerge from this report is that there's an acceptance. You spoke about this, how the lockdown affected, South Africans, as was the case, across around the world. But one of the things that have come out of this is that the average 10-year-old knows less than the average 9-year-old before the academic. I don't know whether to make a big deal of that, but it's something that somewhat stood out for me. But then I'm not the educationist that you are. Prof. Nganyo?
Okay, thanks, Tessa. I think the main issue on the Department of Basic Education, which I think should look in order for it to get a return on its investment, is mainly to look at the quality of educators that are there, because the curriculums have been changed and the government has provided like caps to change the curriculum, and that curriculum addresses the demands of the country properly. However, the educators that are there in the system need to be reskilled, they need to be upskilled so that they can provide those scarce skills like the mathematics, the numerical skills, because now you find out that our learners are not ready for taking these skills. And when the benchmark is done across the other countries, that's where we see the difference now in our South African education. And this is not ending there. It goes as well as a level of career choices of our students, because our students, when they choose careers after matric, they can't, because they choose mathematical literacy, of which now they are being restricted to choose any other thing. So where is the investment now? Because the government is paying a lot of money, and also the teachers, even though we say that the teachers are paid, the teachers are still crying because they are it's a career that is not paid well, because a teacher that is teaching mathematics and a person who has joined another career of mathematics is going to earn more than a teacher who's teaching mathematics. So even if the government is doing those investments, there's that risk now that is there, that we cannot get the investment, because we need to reskill the educators, and we need to also recognize the skills and try to link the skills to remuneration, not just pay salaries only, but the salaries must be paid to more those that have gained new skills. Thank you.
Mr. Maganata, you seem to have a problem with the comments, and the reports the parts that refer to SATU. But the interesting thing for me was that the report actually quotes the ministerial task team. In other words, what our findings are actually things that were said by the ministerial task team in 2016, that 6, probably more, of the 9 provinces. SADTU there is the de facto charge of the management, administration, and priorities in education. It was that task team that actually found that SADTU had a stranglehold over South Africa's education system.
Definitely, Vuyo. But the fact that SADTU, obviously SADTU is the biggest union in the terrain of basic education, and obviously this means that since they've got many members, obviously there will be more of them that will be represented as well in various categories, including management. But I wanted to say that obviously, if you look at their modus operandi, they too are an organization which has got good intentions of improving the education system. This has been said on many occasions by their General Secretary, Mr. Mbwena Maludeke. And so I don't think that we can necessarily blame or put the blame on the union itself, because the union does not deploy members to go and, do bad things within the system. I think that even if you were to remove SADTU today, if you were to remove all of their members and just bring in teachers who are not affiliated to any union, it does not necessarily mean that we would automatically see the improvements in relation to the performance of learners within the terrain of education. I've mentioned the issue of poor infrastructure, particularly in poor communities as well as township schools. But at the same time, programs that are lacking. You'll agree with me that as we move into the 4th industrial revolution, there's a need to modernize our education system. And currently, as we speak, even though in provinces such as Gauteng, the former MEC, Panyaza Lesupi, has ensured that learners have gadgets which can assist them in doing research, but also, to work towards this goal of bridging the digital divide. Some of those gadgets never came back to schools. Some of them got stolen. Issues of vandalism where schools are broken into, and infrastructure in such school stolen by people who reside in communities. So I'm saying that there are many things or issues that needs to be addressed. Issues of safety, for example. We see day in, day out, schools in townships, safety is not always guaranteed. And hence, even the teachers in those schools don't always find a conducive environment for learning and teaching. Hence, you find that even the teachers themselves take their own children to private schools instead, as opposed to keeping them in the public schools. So I think that we need an overhaul of the system. We really need drastic measures that can be taken. A political will is needed in this case to ensure that we improve learning and teaching primarily for public schools. Because in private schools, everything seems to be okay. Learners there are learning on a daily basis, but it's not the case in public schools. I don't think that we can start only as a problem, but teachers in general need to take collective responsibility for the failure of the system.
Well, speaking of political will, Dr. Taylor, the report points out that the ministerial task team found that there was criminality, that no government officials implicated in the 2014-2015 jobs for cash scandals has been prosecuted or suspended. Not one of the key MTT recommendations to fight corruption and push back state capture has been implemented.
So I think the minister initiated this task team and welcomed the findings and cooperated all along. I think some of those recommendations are in fact being dealt with through the Basic Education Law Amendment Bill, which is currently going through a very intensive round of consultation, especially those around the powers of school governing bodies and appointments. So in many ways, there are processes to follow on from the recommendations of those reports. On the issue of prosecutions, I think it would be difficult for us as the department to comment, or because it would be more in the realm of the police services and prosecutorial authorities to pursue those. But we, as the department, we certainly cooperated, but also to say that the provincial departments were key in terms of cooperating with the authorities to pursue issues of criminality.
But I mean, where you have the powers to actually, suspend or take people through disciplinary processes, fire them even. The question is whether you have done that. Well, the suggestion here is that you haven't done so, or certainly not you haven't met the public's expectations of what ought to have happened.
That is the suggestion made there. I'm not aware of any issues of criminality or alleged criminality in the national department amongst officials at that level. That's why I said that the role of provinces is key, because they're the employers of teachers, of school principals. And so issues of disciplinary hearings that need to be pursued happen at a provincial level primarily. But as I said, there are other areas where, as a national department, we do have a role to play. And one very important area has been in the development of the Bela Bill, which has taken some time, but not for lack of being active. It's in an active process of multiple rounds of consultation.
A related issue which would apply to the national department is the issue of cadre deployment, which this report says remains a big problem.
It's becoming quite a political question, which, as the Director for Research, I can't really comment on cadre deployment. I know the report does note, the union affiliation of a number of senior officials in the department.
But also skills.
Well, and
because
again,
with cadre deployment, it has been found that people who may not fully meet the qualifications, or where there are better people, those people or people who qualify more than the others don't get employed because preference is given to people with less qualifications. That's the suggestion they made.
It's the suggestion, and it is somewhat speculative. The facts that are presented in the report and in the ministerial task team are about the union affiliation of particular members. But to be affiliated to a union is not in itself evidence of wrongdoing. It's not in itself evidence of preferential appointments or anything untoward in the appointment process. So until such a time as it becomes unlawful to be affiliated to such a union, which I don't think is likely to happen, it remains mere speculation. And I'm not in a position. I also have not seen any skills audits or any evidence to suggest that the senior members of government departments are lacking in particular skills.
Is there a shortage of information in this regard? Has no research been done by academics and academic institutions, Prof, on this question of the leadership broadly, within the basic education sector?
There is a lot of research, and that research is being documented in articles and also in report to basic education.
And what does it point to?
It points to the issue of we need to empower our leadership, especially the principals and the management at schools and even at the district or provincial offices. There is a lot of research on the models now on leadership that we need to provide and empower our management on those ones. And we also need to also provide leadership on how to implement the curriculum or the policies, because the government is done a lot of policies, but the problem is in the implementation. And there is a lot of research documented by universities on this regard. However, the issue of research mainly is the problem is that sometimes even if research is done, the way it's communicated to the participants or communicated back to the communities, it has got some challenges sometimes. Otherwise, there is a lot of documented research on leadership, on empowering leaders, and on giving them the strength to how to lead, because you find out that many schools are led by people who do not have the leadership skills.
Speaking of leadership, Mr. Maganeta, the authors of these reports are arguing that the country needs to have a fresh leadership in public education. And they talk about the minister, the DG, the top team at national and provincial levels. They think that that will go very far in achieving a system-wide reform.
Yes, definitely. Leadership is quite important in getting our eggs together. To have a functional development of basic education, obviously you need proper leadership. And I don't think that we are lacking, in my view, in that regard. I think that what is lacking is just the political will to, come up with radical measures to transform the system.
So there's no need. There's no need for a fresh leadership, as the authors of this report call for.
Well, I'm saying that there is a need for proper leadership. I agree with that. But I'm saying currently, if you go down to principals and of course, lower levels, SMTs, at school level, yes, I fully agree that we need to empower our leadership with a view to ensure that they can be able to deliver. But I also want to chip in on this issue or the term cadre deployment, which in my view is being abused. I want to say in the terrain of education, cadre deployment, as far as we know, only ends at political appointments such as the office of the minister as well as the deputy minister. But when it comes to principals as well as deputy principals, SADTU does not have a policy of cadre deployment. You don't find
not quite. Mr. Magat, I mean, if you look at the entire, not just education, government-wide, we know how the cadre deployment works. It works differently from what you've just described. And we've seen examples coming out of the state capture inquiry, and those of us who work, who have worked at for public institutions know what actually happens. But I do get your point, but I'm not going to labor it because we've run out of time, because I still have one question to put to Dr. Taylor here. The authors argue that to move off the bottom of these international tasks, we're going to have to set very realistic national and provincial performance goals. In other words, say in the next 5 years, this is what we're going to see, and that happens, and that would also help instill confidence. People will then say, we can see that there is movement. Otherwise, if it's all about the government, the Department of Education saying, oh, we're doing something about all these things. There are indeed improvements. That is not going to instill a great deal of confidence, but also there's no way of measuring. She cited, Ed Bernstein earlier cited as an example, a target that was put by the president in previous speeches, but we have no record of how far we've gone in actually meeting those targets.
I think it's a very good suggestion, a very good recommendation. We do need to set ambitious targets. and those should be around learning outcomes. And I think that I welcome. So tracking performance against targets such as the president's goal for 10-year-old children to learn to read with meaning is a very important outcome for us to track over time. So I definitely agree with that. South Africa has been one of the fastest improving countries in these international assessments, some of which have been mentioned tonight, admittedly off a low base. So the reality is
Which is the points you made, yeah.
Yeah, the reality is both that our performance is still low, it is still very unequal, but it is improving. And in the discourse around the low and unequal part, we sometimes miss that there have been significant improvements. And we need to build on those improvements by focusing and refocusing the attention around those sorts of learning outcomes, such as reading, especially in the wake of the pandemic, which did hurt early grade reading and maths outcomes, especially for those parts of the system that were less able to turn to remote schooling options. So I really do agree with that call.
Dr. Taylor, Mr. Maganeta, Prof. Nganyo, let me thank all of you for agreeing to come on. But we've only scratched the surface of these issues. But thank you very much for availing yourselves. And that brings us to the end of tonight's program. Do join us again tomorrow evening, same time. Have a good night.